Right, well, let's go. Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see so many people here this afternoon. This will last about an hour, although it may seem longer than that, but it will just be an hour. And I'll talk probably for about 50 minutes-ish, and then let's have comments and questions and corrections as well afterwards. Right, so the parade story, Eastbourne's fine seafront parades. I've used this slide before on a previous talk about the East End of Eastbourne, but it's very relevant to this. The red bit is the wet bit, and this is only 1,000 years ago, that's all. We're talking about late Saxon times. You can see the extent to which the sea has inundated the area, well, the eastern part of Eastbourne and beyond. So you've got the sea lapping on the shores of Hailsham at this time, just 1,000 years ago. And if you wanted to walk along the coast, of course, you wouldn't go eastwards, you would go northwards from here and really take the line of King's Drive towards Willingdon. And you would look out across a lagoon stretching across to Bexhill, and there would be little islands sticking up. And of course the Anglo-Saxon for island is I, and you'd be looking at Langnye and Hydenye in Hampden Park. Interesting, isn't it? So what happened to change all that? Well, the crumbles happened. The crumbles are our blessing. Here we are. Here's a diagram. The black bit at the top is real terra firma, and the grey bit is the crumbles as now existing, a massive shingle bank that has built up in round about 1,000 years, probably less, to really close off that large lagoon I've just been talking about. And you can see the dotted line at the bottom, and that's the extent of the crumbles less than 300 years ago. So Langley Point extended a mile further out to sea 300 years ago than it does now, and of course it's been eroded over time. And I think the lesson here, it's an incredibly dynamic and changeable coastline. And that's one of the reasons why we've got our parades, as we'll see in a moment. Here's a map from 1820. You can see the town of Eastbourne, we now call it Old Town, at the top around St Mary's Church. Below that you can see Southbourne, which is the South Street Grove Road area, clustered around where the town hall is now. Right over to the left or the west, you can see a little hamlet called Meads. And, down here you can see Sea Houses, which is the area around Bushy Yard and the Leave Hall, etc., near to the Queen's Hotel. And the pier itself was to be round about there. Now you can see this massive area on the right of loose shingle, which we now call the crumbles, being called at various times the waste, because it literally was the waste in medieval times. Some people have called it the Eastbourne Desert. But it's a massive area, and of course today when we talk about the crumbles, we talk about an area somewhere where Asda is, don't we? Well, it is at Asda, but the crumbles actually starts just below the Queen's Hotel. And so a lot of the eastern part of Eastbourne, and here, this is the line of Seaside here. It still is the barrier between the loose shingle area of the crumbles and the marshland which has gradually been reclaimed behind. And everything is really quite low-lying, as you know. Certainly the parts of the marshland of Eastbourne and even parts of Eastbourne town centre are only about 14 feet above what they call ordnance datum. And a good spring tide is also about 14 feet. Put a surge behind that with really bad weather, and it's about 18 feet, and you don't need to do the maths, do you, to work out what happens. And just looking along this coastline, just here, just where the pier is, now this little map shows some low cliffs. And because the parade, as we know it today, is built, we don't really recognise that there are low cliffs there, but there are. sandstone, green sand cliffs, and you can see two little gaps in the cliff just by the Wish Tower there, and we'll talk about that later, and of course at Holywell, just there. So we'll look first of all at Marine Parade and Royal Parade. This is looking down from the Queen's Hotel towards the Redoubt. This is a picture showing the area where the pier is now, and an area called the Round House. And you can see, and it's only an artistic representation, but you can see these low green sand cliffs as seen at that time. And this is the Round House itself. It started off as a horizontal windmill, so the sails didn't go like that, they went like that, horizontally. And actually invented by an Eastbourne chap called Thomas Mortimer, and this one was built in 1750, and it was one of three such windmills in Eastbourne. One here, one on Ocklinge Ridge, and the other one at Pashley Down up above Paradise Woods. And of course the remnants of that are still there to see. This stopped being a windmill about 30 years later and became a little boarding house. And it's important to Eastbourne because this is where the children of George III stayed for some of their summer holidays. And this sort of cachet, as it were, of royal visitors and royal residents in Eastbourne was really quite important to attract interest to the tourist industry. So here's a picture of the same spot some years later. The Burlington Hotel, as we know it today, on the left, has been built, so Grand Parade is in existence. This particular spot here has been in the local news recently with the Roman villa excavations. And it is quite clear, well, as clear as can be, I suppose, that this was a Roman villa really of some significance. It really was quite large. And a lot of people, I think, quite understandably would say, well, it's all connected with Pevensey Castle and Anderida and all that sort of stuff. Well, it isn't really, because Pevensey Castle was built by the Romans towards really right at the end of the Roman occupation. This was built towards the beginning of the occupation, so about 300 years between them. And it really wasn't on the coast at this time. It's probably about 300 yards inland because the shingle was a lot further out. So here we've got sea houses, just a little settlement, certainly before the railway came to Eastbourne and the population exploded. This would have been a place of 300 or 400 people and no more than that. Come in, welcome. There are loads of seats over there on the other side. And here is Marine Parade in all its glory. Pretty pathetic, really. Only about 9 feet wide. Started off just below the Queen's Hotel and went down as far as, I still call it Travel Lodge, but you know where I mean. What's it called now? No, that's Premier Inn. The Travel Lodge, the one that looks like a Christmas cake on the seafront. Shoreview, right, thank you. And then just curled round into Seaside, where those big traffic islands and yucca trees are now. And this is looking at the Anchor Hotel, which is still there. It's the Eastbourne Riviera Hotel now, just before you get down to Fushiades. And the point of this picture is that this is, taken sort of fairly late on, probably in the 1870s. And there's no road here at all. It is just crushed stone. So this sort of part of the parade really just sort of fizzles out. And here's a map from 1875. Where we've been looking is on the left-hand side at the Anchor Hotel and the Albion Hotel, now Travel Lodge. And we come down towards Fushiades, and then all of a sudden there's no road, there's just a load of shingle. Here, just on the right-hand side, we've got the Redoubt Fortress, which we'll come to in a minute. And then, whoops, sorry, doing it again. Just up here, this area around Christchurch, just out of interest, was the Eastbourne's red light district at the time, where all sorts of naughty things went on. Very respectable today, I'm sure. Here's a painting showing the beach, or the Stade, as it was called. Stade is an old Sussex word meaning simply a landing beach, and of course that's still used in Hastings for the fishing beach there. And the Stade certainly wasn't for sunbathing or anything else. It was very much a working beach. Lots of things like timber and coal were imported here and offloaded, also used as a fishing beach, of course. And here's just an example of some of these punts or skiffs were just used for bits of indoor fishing. And then you have much larger luggers, known locally as borners. Everything to do with fishing has a nickname. The borners were so called because they're all built in Eastbourne, said to be faster and more manoeuvrable than the Hastings fleet. Went to sea sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. A crew of 4 or 5 plus a boy of about 11. Certainly the school leaving age didn't increase beyond 10 years until after the mid-1870s. So a boy of 11 would have left school and would expect from this area to sort of go and work on the boats. And boats like this would chase massive herring shoals down the North Sea, through the English Channel, out into the Irish Sea, putting into a port each day to offload their catch. And on a really, really good day, a boat like this could land up to 50,000 fish. Quite incredible. They're sort of like, you know, quite unbelievable for us now with such shortages. So just very, very quickly, just for interest, I won't read it out. The one at the bottom, oysters at Beachy Head, it's, I think, particularly sad this, because up until the 1870s, there were massive oyster beds just off Beachy Head, and then were overfished extensively by the Brighton fleet and were wiped out in just a few years. Very, very sad to see that go. So here we are. Believe it or not, we are looking at the Travel Lodge, or the shore view, and this is what it was like in the 1840s. And this is the first sea wall to be built in the late 1840s. Built of very soft sandstone, not a particularly good idea, but paid for by local residents. Who agreed to a shilling in the pound on their rates in order to pay for their own sea wall. Because prior to this, particularly in 1847, there'd been massive inundation by the sea in the Bourne Street area, and a lot of flooding going on. And things improved a little bit. We're at 1879 now, where the local board, the predecessor of the Borough Council, went for an Act of Parliament, the first Eastbourne Improvement Act, to borrow money, £39,000, to build a proper seawall from the pier down to the redoubt. And they had to build a railway from what we know as the Crumbles now, where Asda is, about 1.5 miles into this point, to import a lot of shingle from elsewhere on the Crumbles to build up the levels. And it's interesting, if you're in the seaside area and you go to the sea from the road seaside, you go up St Albans Road, you go up Cambridge Road to the sea, which is quite interesting. And as we walk along the prom today, we think we're just walking along the pavement, but we're actually walking along a sea wall that's 20 feet deep below our feet. And that sea wall eventually went, well, it still goes, of course, from Holywell right down to the redoubt. And once the sea wall was built, then the land behind, which had been very vulnerable to inundation by the sea, could then be developed. And, you know, all credit to, became the Borough Council by the time the wall was completed, all credit to them, the money they got back on the land sales, etc., and the disposals, more than paid for the original cost of the wall. And you can see here the properties along Royal Parade, which all started out as residential, only converted into hotels at a later time. And this is the travel lodge we've been talking about, then the Albion Hotel. And once the sea wall had been built and the future of this area as a particular destination for visitors east of the pier was assured, then more investment in hotels can take place, and this was massively improved in 1897. Two interesting firsts for this hotel. It was the first building in Eastbourne to have electricity, and it was also the first building to have a telephone, and its number was Eastbourne 1. And it kept that number right up until 1966, believe it or not. And this is Eastbourne's second bandstand, built in 1894. This is opposite Fushiades. A little bit of a PR mistake here, but for the inaugural concert, they asked the Brighton Corporation Band to come and play, as opposed to a local band. And just another shot, you see a sense here of the sea wall, and look at all these bathing machines hard up against the wall, trying to escape any damage from the breaking waves at high tide. But the sea often prevails, and here's a picture from the 1920s, I think, just sort of showing the damage that the sea can still do. So let's just take a very quick look at the redoubt. On the right-hand side here, you can see the redoubt fortress, still there. I think a lot of folk just sort of walk past this and think, oh, the redoubt, and not really aware of what they've got on their doorstep. This is a massive fort, built in the early 1800s, well, completed in 1810, as part of the process of guarding against Napoleonic invasion, and of course supported the system of Martello Towers constructed along the coast. A garrison initially of 300 men, but as soon as it was completed, Trafalgar had already been over by 5 years, and the threat of invasion had of course really disappeared. But always in army use for training purposes and that sort of thing. Only fired twice in anger, 2 shots at a passing French frigate, and they both missed. Taken over by the council from the War Department in 1926 and acquired for £150 at the time. And you can see the gardens there just to the west of it, the Redoubt Music Gardens. And they started to be improved in really sort of like the early 1900s as an employment relief scheme. There have been many employment relief schemes in Eastbourne because it's always had trouble with jobs. And just to finish off this bit of Royal Parade, an aerial shot from the 1920s, you can see the fishermen's huts down at the bottom, many of them still there of course, and all the fishermen who'd previously been up on the Stade had to be moved down here because of the building of the sea wall. They couldn't actually operate from that particular fishing beach. And this land was given over for the use of the fishermen, and you see the little squares behind that, which we now call Fisherman's Green, and that's because the land was actually allocated for the leisure use of the fishermen's families. And you can also see towards the top of the picture an undeveloped area of Crumbles with that water feature in it. Now this became, of course, Prince's Park in the early 1930s, but this is before the work actually started. And it's interesting that a lot of people see the boating lake there and think, oh well, that was constructed at the same time as the park. No, there are records going back to 1280 showing this as a fish stock pond for the monks at Langley Priory. So a natural feature in the landscape, not a boating lake. Grand Parade, something a bit different. Ramrod straight and grand, deliberately grand. This was the key feature of the Duke's idea to have an exclusive resort for Eastbourne. And as soon as the parade was being built, and it started really as soon as the railway arrived, 1849, this started just one or two years later as the the idea of this high-end resort took off. You've got the Burlington Hotel built. Initially, only the middle bit was a hotel. The bits either side were private houses. And if you walk along today and look very carefully, you can still see all the individual doorways of what were previously houses. Now here's a look at the sea wall that was built to the west of the pier this time, built by the Duke's architect, Berry. And again, he used sandstone blocks. And the sandstone blocks actually came from where the the Cavendish Hotel is now. The Cavendish Hotel actually sits on a massive stone quarry that's been filled in. But there's certainly clear evidence that even the Roman castle at Pevensey and Derrida was actually built with stone from the Cavendish quarry. And yes, you can see there that Berry thought that it would be a really good idea to have a stepped wall so it would break up the action of the waves. In fact, it had the opposite. It allowed the waves to roll up the wall, and this lower parade often got flooded at high tide. The whole thing had to be replaced about 40 years later because the soft sandstone wasn't a perfect material for building a sea wall. Here's a very early picture. This is probably, I can't see any pier on there. This is looking down towards where the pier is, really from where the bandstand is now. And you can see the early parade, and you can see the tiers already being constructed. You can see that under construction. And here's a little bit later. This will be certainly after around about 1880 or even later. You can see how the parade isn't as wide as it is today. A lot of planting and grassed areas in it. This building just up here, the Chatsworth, sorry, I've forgotten the name of it. the Chatsworth, very interesting. A hotel now, but when it was built as 3 back-to-back houses. And probably the plushest back-to-back houses in the land, I would have thought. It was only converted into a hotel in 1905. And here we are, we're on the Wish Tower Hill, looking down towards where the Lifeboat Museum is now, and really quite a grand Edwardian parade. It's this bit at the bottom I just want to mention here. Remember earlier I talked about there being a little inlet here, as shown on that very early map. And there is some evidence, although not conclusive, that there was some sort of creek here. Whether it was a natural creek or whether it was man-made isn't quite sure, but it was quite clear that in the area around where Devonshire Park is now, which is incredibly low-lying, as you know, because from here you walk down to Devonshire Park, that there was a lot of stoneworking going on by the Romans and others, and of course they needed a way of shipping it out. So it's quite possible that there was some sort of shipping connection here. Certainly when St Mary's Church in Old Town was built with stone from Caen in northern France, we do know it was actually imported at this particular point. This particular area of Eastbourne in early medieval times was actually known as Longport. So there's a clue. So here we are back at the Burlington Hotel, the Carpet Gardens, taken over by the council in the 1870s. But 20 years prior to that, they had in fact been the private gardens of the Burlington houses on the other side of the road. And I understand that they grew particularly good onions here during the Second World War. So. And another shot of the Queen's Hotel, the last of the big 4 hotels to be built in Eastbourne, in 1880, completed in 11 months flat. I don't think we could do that today. 11 months to build that hotel. And this time, again, the Duke's architect, this time his name was Curry, designed the hotel, and people say that it was deliberately situated there, right at the end of Grand Parade, to say, this is the end of everything that's important in Eastbourne. You've no need to look beyond at what lies on the other side. When you stand with your back to the pier, have you noticed that the road is incredibly wide at that point? That's because it had to accommodate a roundabout. And the roundabout was there so that carriages could turn. And they had to turn because they couldn't go any further. Having come down Grand Parade, everything stopped. There was no road connection between Grand Parade and Marine Parade, as there is today. And you can just sort of see this very low-lying area here. It's just a footpath that connected the two parades, and that was called Junction Parade for an obvious reason. And you can see here, you can imagine what that's going to be like, passing between the two parades on a stormy day. And it wasn't until 1899, almost 50 years since Grand Parade had been built, that the two parades were actually connected. 50 years without a join up. The pier, well, this is the pier, constructed in 1870, it was in this sort of state. New Year's Day, 1877, a massive storm, as you can see, had washed away the landward half of it. And it was reconstructed very, very quickly. And you can see the ramp halfway along. You might notice that the landward half of the pier is 6 feet higher now than the seaward half. And that was to avoid the repeat of waves crashing underneath the soffits of the pier and causing the original damage. And of course, as you go along now, you go down that ramp halfway along. The pier in Eastbourne was the only one in the country that cost twopence to go on. Every other pier apparently cost a penny. And that was a deliberate act to keep the riff-raff off. Right. This is the pier in Edwardian times. You can see it's getting populated by a few more buildings now. And I've just put this one up. This is, I suppose, the pier in all of its Edwardian splendour. You can see on the left-hand side, animated pictures daily. And this is about 1902, and these were the first moving pictures, cinema pictures, to be shown in Eastbourne. And I've just put this one in. This is a pier, 1950s and onwards. I just think this is a marvellous example of modern architecture, really. So, the bandstand. Here we are, the first bandstand, built in 1889, known as the bird cage for obvious reasons. And I think it's very interesting, just looking up here at Devonshire Place, what a marvellous boulevard that is when it's not full of parked cars and everything else. Actually 80 feet from one side to the other. And there's no arena, of course. The bandstand was just on legs on the beach. But nonetheless, very popular because with no arena, you could get free performances. Didn't have to pay. And then in the early 1930s, everything was torn down and something quite different was constructed. You can see this taking shape. And of course, you've got this absolutely wonderful Art Deco bandstand arena that we still enjoy. And this was capable of seating 3,000 people. So really quite something. So, and we're going to offend this lady at the front again.
It's the classes, isn't it? That's what you're talking
it is. Oh, it's very much. It's very much. It was actually so that certainly in Victorian times there was a distinction between who would be expected to use the upper parade and who would be expected to use the lower parade. There were certain conventions. And certainly on a Sunday, no gentleman would be expected to walk on the upper parade if he wasn't wearing a morning suit. It was like that. The upper parade is almost entirely relegated to the upper 10, the top 10% of society. These promenaders look down with severe contempt on the motley crowd of nondescript blah, blah, blah. Isn't it interesting? I mean, the Victorians were not backward in coming forward in talking about class. And here's the lower parade, where things were a bit more liberal, a bit more relaxed, and certainly sort of busier and I suppose more commonplace. This is where all the entertainment was permitted to take place. People could tout for you to go on their boats or take your photograph or convert to whatever religion they were promoting at the time, Punch and Judy shows, organ grinders, all sorts of things going on. And here's a lovely little shot of a Punch and Judy show just below the pier. So let's look at the Western parades. Here's a nice Edwardian party on the Wish Tower slopes. Oh, and there's the, I mentioned the lifeboat museum as it is now. This, of course, was the lifeboat house right up until 1926, I think it was. I think it was built just before 1900, 1899, so it was there for 27 years. Prior to that, the lifeboat house is where Metropole Court is now, near to Fushiades, and just round the back of Metropole Court there's a substation. And that used to be, it's still there, that actually used to be the lifeboat house. So this was here operating as the main lifeboat until 1926 and I think became a museum in the 1930s. The whole area of the Wish Tower and the Western Lawns, when you see it from the air, you realise really how extensive it is. And the Western Lawns themselves, designed again by Curry, the Duke's architect, and was actually just for its first couple of years in the 1880s, private open space, and until the council took a lease on it in about 1885, I think it was. And here's just an example of the Madeira shelter. This is sort of roughly where the timber deck is now for the Western View Cafe. And here's the church parade in Eastbourne. Now, this is where the best, or the so-called best people of Eastbourne made a point of congregating, particularly on a Sunday. By this time, this is about 1900, it was public open space, but there were sort of like subtle ways, subtle conventions, if you like, of making sure that only the right people were there. It quickly became known as Eastbourne's Marriage Bureau, and local people, with some justification, called it the Snoot. The Snoot. Now you can see here, this is interesting. That looks like a little police box here. Let's take a very quick look at this. Now this was actually built by public subscription for the cabbies. It was a shelter for the cabbies. And in fact, there are replicas of this, exact replicas, both in Madrid and in Athens, because the King of Spain and the Queen of Greece, respectively, when they were staying at the Grand Hotel, were so impressed by this that they asked for copies to be made in their own cities. And this was dismantled in the 1930s. Now, we'll go from here, heading towards Holywell. And today, it looks very different from this. There's something like half a mile of chalk cliff up to 120 feet high from the sea to the top between Western Lawns and Holywell. And what the Duke of Devonshire did in a 4-year project, a massive civil engineering project, actually tamed a cliff. And hundreds of people worked on this. And you can see some of the work underway and gradually taking shape. And in all, something like 500,000 cubic yards of chalk were taken out of here using really nothing more than pick and shovel. And here's the sort of thing that we see today. Right down on the left-hand side, you can see the sea wall was built 20 feet deep. You can see Madeira Way running through the middle, as you know, all sorts of connecting paths. And you've got King Edward Parade here, and then above that at the top you've got the road that leads up to the hydro. So a massive transformation of this cliff. And all of that was transferred in 1902 to the council, but with conditions, and you can see all the conditions. You can't even cough really, so this was part of keeping this part of the parade really exclusive and free from any sort of perceived nuisance. And the Borough Council actually readily adopted these ideas, these conditions, and actually enshrined them immediately into local bylaws and added the now famous one to that, which was dogs may not bark on the beach. So what happened to this 500,000 cubic yards of chalk? Well, part of it went here. You know, when you get to the top of King Edward's Parade, you then take the windy road with all the bends going up to Beachy Head. This is it. It's on a giant chalk causeway that was constructed virtually by hand. You don't see it like that now, of course, because it's covered in trees. And the other half of the chalk was taken by horse-drawn tram down Cornfield Terrace, Chiswick Place, along Cornfield Road, round the back of where Barclays Bank is now, and was all the foundations for all the houses that were built in that area in the 1880s, Tideswell Road, Longster Road, Ashford Road, etc., to reclaim the marsh. This is Holywell. Well, we now know it as Holywell. Holywell itself is sort of round about there. It's not a well, of course, it's a spring, but a well. The water wells out of the chalk. And this really is the area, I suppose, that we call Holywell now, an old chalk and flint pit, simply called the Gore, which is another word for a bit of wasteland. And this again was started off with an employment scheme, a local employment scheme to provide jobs in the early 1900s, and later another employment relief scheme in the 1920s to enhance it, to make the Italian gardens. And you can see the early tea chalet. Now, above all that is what we now call Helen Gardens. And it's quite interesting that if you stand here at Bede School and look down right to the Lifeboat Museum, there's about 30 acres of green open space on the seafront. I think we're incredibly fortunate to have that. Helen Gardens itself was acquired from the Duke of Devonshire's estate by the Grand Hotel to build a hotel annex right on the seafront here. That never came to anything, and then the land was purchased from them by Hornby Lewis, by a family called Hornby Lewis, and they intended to build just one house on here for their own use. While the house was being built, they decided to live in a little pad down the road, pro tem, called Chaseley, which you might know. And Hornby Lewis, the man, actually died, and the whole thing never actually took off. And it was in 1935 that his wife, Helen Hornby Lewis, actually gave this land free to the people of Eastbourne to use in perpetuity for recreational use. It's a nice little story. And here's the sort of the handover ceremony in 1935. I think it's quite interesting along the top here. I can't see any wall or fence. So. And just below that, it's now disappeared, was Weircombe Cottage. It's sort of halfway down the cliff. And this was the home of a woman called Winifred Barnes, who was apparently a great beauty, and she was sort of a comedy actress and singer in the West End theatre in the 20s and early 30s. And certainly people like Noel Coward were regular visitors here. And after she died in 1935, it was let as a holiday home. And a chap called Frank Belisha often came here. He was a transport minister and, of course, gave his name to Belisha Beacons. This was demolished in the late 1970s. So, Collins Flats is the final bit. Where are Collins Flats? Here are Collins Flats. This is Helen Gardens we've just been looking at. Oh, look, there's the little cottage before it was demolished. And if you're interested in a walk, you go up past Bede School and you turn left at the tea place and you walk along there to Whitbread Hollow. And if you look down towards the sea, there's a massive, well, it's an old chalk pit. There's a massive pit there. Now that flat area at the bottom is called Collins Flats. And it's got a nice little history. Here's a very old photograph of it. And this was used for a variety of industrial sort of activities, frowned upon in Eastbourne, of course. And you can see here where a little way has been dug through the rock reef so that fishing boats, you can see one here, can actually get in and out. And there's only about 2 feet spare either side to get a fishing boat through. This was a small fishing community, and the Boniface family, if you lived in Eastbourne for some time, you must have heard of the Bonifaces. And this was really their territory. So it was a little fishing station, and it was also used in the manufacture of lime. We talked about the marshes earlier and the reclamation of the marshes. Marshes, incredibly acidic. You need lime to turn it into good quality pasture. And a lot of the lime was actually made here. And of course, being by the sea, it could be transported off easily. There's also a larger blacksmith shop as well. And here's sort of some of the cottages. All that disappeared at a stroke in 1896 when the Eastbourne Water Company said, we haven't got enough water, we need more water, we're going to sink aquifers into the chalk by Holywell. And of course, as soon as you get water being extracted from below, you can't have things like lime kilns and everything going on above. So everything by order was sort of cleared off in a very short time. Now, I'm going to upset some of the audience here. The struggle to remain exclusive. It was the whole point of the Duke of Devonshire's and others' investment that Eastbourne was going to be a premier resort. And, I'll use the word again, they didn't like the riffraff, because that would spoil things. So, very, very close control over everything, all building, all behaviours, all activities, a bylaw for everything. There was a proposal in the early 1880s, there was a draft Act of Parliament, which never came to anything, to build another station in the East End, so that the trippers, the excursionists from London, wouldn't have to pass through the better parts of town. In the 1890s, the council tried twice to ban the sale of excursion tickets from London in the season so that Londoners would not come down here. It didn't come to anything because it's actually unlawful. Things got even worse for them in 1904 because they started running trains direct from Liverpool and Manchester. So, the parade was quite closely managed. Everything that went on there had to be licensed. The boatmen were licensed. Anybody selling anything had to have a license from the council. And the Sabbath, the Sunday, I'll just sort of refer to very quickly. Quite typical in a sense of Victorian and Edwardian times, but you couldn't do anything in Eastbourne on a Sunday. It wasn't until 1922 that buses even ran on a Sunday. It wasn't until 1922 that you could swim in the sea on a Sunday. And if you did, you had to be out by 11 a.m. in the morning. And it wasn't until 10 years later, 1932, that you could actually use any of the facilities in the town's parks. You couldn't, say, play tennis or play bowls or anything else. So the Sabbath in Eastbourne was really quite something. It's worth a talk of its own, really. Here we are. One encounters so many of the lower classes on the parades these days. People such as doctors and managers. They were in trade. Frowned upon.
It's disgusting, I think.
Well, there we are. Well, I blame the Victorians. So So here we are, again, we're back to around about 1900, really trying to hold on to this bubble of exclusivity, and really just one generation later, 1930s, the First World War later, massive social change, and of course its impact on Eastbourne and the tourist industry is really quite considerable. And then you go on another generation from that to the 1960s. This isn't airborne, this is a Sunday in Eastbourne. By this time you could swim in the sea, by the way, it was all right. Quite incredible. So I'll just spend 5 minutes or so just talking generally about sort of seaside activities. I mean, a lovely picture this, I love this. Real sort of Edwardian seaside holiday. Another one, look how everybody's congregated around the bandstand so they can get a free listen. And just look at all the bathing machines and horses that there are on the beach. There were, in fact, certainly at its peak in the 1880s, 200 bathing machines operating on Eastbourne beaches. Or you could take a bath chair ride. You could obviously take a walk on the pier, and you could look at the Eastbourne regatta. Look at all the people here looking at the regatta. This ran for about 70 or 80 years and was incredibly popular, and it certainly was much loved by the local fishing lads because they're really quite good at this sort of thing, and they loved to take on and beat what they called the jolly boys. These were the toffs, and they could really beat them. Or you could hire a boat of your own and just go out, no rules, no health and safety. Or you can go out in somebody else's boat, these pleasure boats. The boatmen were all under quite strict licence. It was quite well controlled. Or take a paddle steamer. And as late as 1920, you could take one of these steamers for half a guinea, return to Boulogne and back. How wonderful. A nice shot of the pier that we don't normally see. Or for £1, which was an absolute fortune, of course, you could take a plane ride. This plane would have been made in Eastbourne, at the Eastbourne airport. But that's the subject of another talk. And I think this is absolutely wonderful. Here is a very, very early water plane by the Queen's Hotel. And you can see all the thousands of people who gathered to see it take off, not realising that they're going to get soaking wet as soon as it starts. And entertainment on the beach, a lot of minstrel groups like this. This one is really quite unusual because it features a woman. They're almost entirely all men, mainly amateur, mainly before 1900, before firmer licensing came in. And they just used to earn money for their own holidays, really, or to make ends meet. Sometimes they had a stage, sometimes they were just sort of on the shingle. They used to bottle the audience, which means that they put round a clear glass bottle so that they could see how much money people were putting in. And then the bottle was broken in front of the troupe at the end of the day, and the money shared out equally. And they were overtaken by the Pierrot groups, who became very popular after 1900. And a lot of the stars of of national radio sort of cut their teeth, as it were, in groups like this. People like Jimmy Handley and people like that. And we talked about the Redoubt Music Gardens, massive transformation in 1935, and this absolutely splendid Art Deco arena was opened up, fallen into disrepair now, I'm afraid, but capable of seating 2,000 people. And or you could listen to the Salvation Army band. If anybody has got 2 minutes at the end and they want to hear about the Salvation Army riots, I'll talk about that, but leave it for the time being. And finally, I just want to talk about bathing. Yes, bathing in Eastbourne. Right. Up until certainly, yes, 1922. Well, no, beyond that, you couldn't actually change on the beach at all. And you had to use a bathing machine if you were anywhere between the Wish Tower and the Redoubt. On the other side of the Redoubt, you could have wild swimming, which was it's like Sodom and Gomorrah, really. You could do anything there. Certainly 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, if a lady wanted to go for a swim, you would use one of these. You would climb in, the horse would trundle you down the beach into the water. You would change out of your clothing and put on a long modesty shift, which went down to the floor, had lead weights sewn into the hem so it didn't swirl up in the water. You would then open, I don't know if you can just see it there, a little flap at the side, just to make sure that nobody was leering at you. And then you would descend into the water, where quite a coarse woman would tell you to hang on to your rope, so a 6-foot rope, so you didn't get lost. She would then come up to you and put both hands on your head and dip you totally in the water, total immersion. You were going for a dip. Interesting, isn't it? And once that delight was over, you clamber back and repeat the whole process. So that was swimming in Eastbourne. And that really didn't change until just after the First World War. And the council arranged for, in 1919, for all the bathing machines to disappear. And they were replaced by these cubicles that you can see here, which cost 6pence for 30 minutes to hire. Or, again, just here, you could take away from a particular point a canvas fold-up thing on poles, just for a penny, and you could get changed in that. But you couldn't actually get changed on the beach without using either of those two facilities. And that went right on until 1929, when the Macintosh protest happened. And people who stayed in hotels just across the road thought, this is absolutely stupid. There's the sea, we're here, we'll get changed in our room, we'll put our Macs on and we'll just walk across the road. No, bylaw against it to stop that happening. And in the end, 40 people said, we've had enough of this, and they all marched deliberately down the prom wearing their Macs, and they were all arrested. And they were all charged and fined. And this was so ridiculous in 1929, it made Eastbourne look a bit of a laughingstock, that it said that the Home Secretary personally phoned the town clerk here and said, this must stop. And of course it did. But that's going right up to 1929. So here's just a list of sort of seaside activities, and I've just saved my favourite one till last, which I call fly catching, which is So that's it. Thank you.